Hi, this is Liv Morgan, and you are listening to No One Knows, a deep dive podcast into the mysterious death of Joann Matouk Romain. In episode 1, I left you with the name Ed Milam and a mysterious voice recording. Joann's case has not previously been linked to the name Ed Milam at all. This is the first time in the first place that you are going to hear publicly about Ed Milam and how he was identified. When Joann went missing in 2010, Ed Milam wasn't on the radar of Joann's family. It wasn't until just a few years later, through digging in phone records of Tim Matouk, that they would find a phone number with a connected name of Ed Milam. In the course of this episode, in investigating Tim Matouk, Joann's cop cousin, we're going to end up concluding that Ed Milam is connected and he has some sort of significance. But first, we need to continue with our timeline. Let's take a step back to January of 2010, just days after Joann went missing from St. Paul's Catholic Church in Grosse Pointe Farms. Michelle and Kelly recall showing up to Grosse Pointe Farms police station, demanding to speak with Dan Jensen, the chief, about the case. In tow was 15 to 20 other friends and family of Joann. Chief Jensen became enraged when questioned about the investigation of Joann being missing. Jensen responded, quote, "I don't know what you are all doing here. The police report that was generated up last night was written up wrong. There were no footprints that led from the vehicle to the water. There were only footprints across the street, and we don't even know if those are Joann's. This is simply a missing persons case, and we are going to give it to Grosse Pointe Woods, where she resides." Then Jensen would slam the door in the lobby and head back into his office. As the days and weeks go on, the family is still searching for answers on where Joann is. No sign of Joann has come up anywhere. Water searches had only been conducted by police that first evening of January 12th and into the early morning of January 13th, 2010. After that initial night, no further searching was conducted in the water by officials, and land searches were never conducted. Police are not willing to look past suicide. Despite the evidence pointing towards possible foul play, and Officer Jensen publicly stating that this was, quote, a missing persons case. If you recall from episode 1, the family had begun hiring their own experts to conduct searches, including Bill Robinette. He was the lead diver of Midwest Technical and a retired Detroit police officer. Bill stands by his statement, "If Joann was there, we would have found her." Joann's face is everywhere. Her face begins to flash across news stations, locally and nationally, missing posters, billboards. To gather any information the family can get, they have opened up a tip line where people can call in anonymously. The family does not have any leads at this time. In addition to not being notified of any witnesses, Grosse Pointe Woods is now handling the case. Let's remember, that is not where Joann went missing from, but that is where she lives. And the relationship between Joann's children and the officers is understandably strained. We all remember Tim Matouk, Joann's cousin, who she was worried about before she went missing. We talked about him a lot in episode 1. It may surprise you to learn that Tim Matouk, Joann's cousin, was one of the very first people to contact the anonymous tip line. It was along the lines of, "Joann committed suicide and you should probably look to her brother John Matouk." Am I the only one who finds this odd? The lead person who the family is concerned about is one of the first people to call the tip line. John Matouk. It's a name you are going to begin hearing throughout Joann's story. It would be Joann's youngest brother. John Matouk was actually once a very successful entrepreneur, ranking in on Crain's Detroit 40 Under 40. At one point, he struggled financially. Despite having good business, the relationship between Joann and her brother John was very close. Joann cared for her brother John, and the relationship was vice versa. A few family members say John made few unethical business deals that may have owed money back to some people, estimated around $250,000. It doesn't seem like the relationship between John and Michelle's children is the best. In the long run, their relationship might be strained due to different views on the case, but ultimately, they are fighting for the same cause. I want to make this very clear. Joann's children do not believe that John had any doing in Joann going missing. They do not think that John, at his own hands, played any type of role in anything happening to Joann. But a few of them have concerns that if somebody wanted to get to John, the best way to do it would to be hurting Joann. It wouldn't be long after Tim's anonymous phone call to the tip line informing them about Joann Matouk, Joann's brother, that the family would begin their next uphill battle on who and where and why somebody would hurt Joann. We are just a few weeks out from the night that Joann went missing in January of 2010. Officers asked the family to pick up the items that they took from the scene, starting with the purse that they took as, air quotes, evidence. As you may recall, Joann's purse was found locked in the Lexus SUV's front passenger seat. Her purse had only been purchased 6 weeks prior, and her children recall that the strap was torn when they found the purse on the passenger seat. When the family learned that the bag had not been tested for any sort of DNA or any other testing had been completed, the family became concerned and confused about the investigation that was happening with Joann. Personally, I still find Joann's bag to be one of the biggest mysteries from the early days of the investigation. How does a possible crime scene item not have any further testing being done? Despite being a non-investigator, I have trouble comprehending how evidence is not preserved and tested, regardless of the scenario on how somebody goes missing. A lack of proper evidence makes it difficult to solve possible crimes. The simple fact is, you cannot go back and collect evidence. It is impossible to fix bad police work after it's already been done. You have one chance to gather all of the evidence and all of the information that you need. Joann's purse now sits on a shelf at Michelle's house as a constant reminder of the failed investigation that the police did. Are you ready for our second piece of physical evidence? The Lexus SUV, or Joann's car, as the police call it? Buckle the fuck up. You may remember the Lexus found at St. Paul's Catholic Church that Joann was last seen driving. It was actually registered to Michelle, her daughter. It would be only on day 14 after Joann vanished did Grosse Pointe Woods go to Grosse Pointe Farms to check out the vehicle's gas level and track any GPS tracking that may have been on it. It's impossible. How do you go 14 days without checking that first? Especially since eyewitnesses state that they saw the car there and then it left. Upon receiving Joann's car back, Joann's children thoroughly examined the GPS. And it would be shocking that the GPS would be set to bridges and tolls at the time of them receiving the car back. St. Paul Catholic Church, where Joann went missing, is roughly about 15 minutes from the city of Detroit. And Detroit to Canada is a bridge or a tunnel between the two countries. Don't forget this, it's going to become relevant here soon. Now we need to take a look at what the police did inside of the Lexus SUV. Investigators dusted the car to find fingerprints. Through my investigation in this podcast, I have found out that this is not the proper way to gather fingerprints, despite the fact that I am not an expert. It is not recommended to dust for fingerprints on the leather of an interior car. Since it is leather, it should have been fumed with superglue. Superglue fuming is a chemical method of detection that they use to gain fingerprints off of non-porous surfaces. This is extremely common, and looking further into this, police should have known that if they were beginning to get fingerprints off of a leather-seated vehicle, that using dust would not work, and that the only option to be able to get fingerprints would have been using superglue fuming. Investigators tell Joann's children that the car returned with no fingerprints except for those of Joann and her 3 children, Michelle, Kelly, and Michael. Michelle, Kelly, and Michael never gave fingerprints to officers for comparisons. They don't have government jobs that explain why their prints would be in the system. They've never been arrested, never been to prison or jail. I find it odd. If you don't have the fingerprints of the individuals, how are you able to compare the fingerprints to the vehicles? But I go on. It's too late at the point to do anything. The car is ready for pickup. Michelle and Kelly send their brother Michael to sign off on the car and pick it up. When I'm talking with Michelle and Kelly, they're telling me that something was odd about the encounter that Michael had when he picked up the vehicle. Talking with Michael now, she says at the time that they didn't think much of it by sending their little brother to get the car. But now that they think of it, they probably should have spearheaded that. When Michael arrives, he recalls signing off on a blank sheet of computer paper. It wouldn't be any sort of evidence release form, and the entire situation, picking up the vehicle, felt super non-formal and honestly like bad record keeping. It bothered him enough that when he got home with the Lexus and keys in hand, he mentioned it to Michelle and Kelly. So Michael's talking with Michelle and Kelly. He tosses the keys down and he begins telling them how strange the encounter was. And then it hit them. The keys that he set on the counter, the keys that was handed to him by the officers, was a set of missing keys. You heard me right. Missing keys. Let's break this down. The keys that were given to Michael at the police station were Joann's set of car keys that had been stolen from an open house just a few weeks prior to Joann going missing. As of this recording, officers are still unable to recall where the keys came from. In depositions, officers state they have no recollection of where the keys came from, who gave them the missing keys, or how they came into the possession of the keys. These were stolen keys out of Joann's open house just weeks prior. We need to remember something super important. The night that the Lexus was found in the church parking lot. In episode 1, we state they had to call a tow truck to unlock the SUV, and that nothing would be found, any sort of keys inside of the purse. Joann's body has not been found yet. The purse does not have any keys in it. How do officers that are investigating a possible missing persons, but they're calling it a suicide, how do those officers end up with keys that were stolen out of Joann's house? The story of the keys isn't going to end here. It's just the beginning of a shit show investigation that was completed by Grosse Pointe Farms and Grosse Pointe Woods Police. There's no question that they would need to lead their own investigation in order to find the truth. Joann's children began searching for answers on their own. Through this investigative podcast, I've been honored to interview a lot of the people that were in the investigation at the time that it was occurring. Before Joann was found, after Joann was found, during the time that they were looking for Joann. Here is Kelly. She's a psychic medium from Charlotte, North Carolina, and I had the chance to speak with her in regards to the reading and information that she gave the family before Joann was found.
I stated that, she did not commit suicide. She was taken. She was, at the time she was taken from the church. I saw 2 men involved at that moment. What Spirit was giving to me. I felt that she was going to be found, because everything when you do a psychic information, it's all about location, right? Especially if somebody's missing, where are they?
Yeah.
And so I saw that she would be found. I read in January for them, beginning of January, in January, I should say. And so I said to her, she will be found in the springtime. There are 2 fishermen that will find her. She is by a bridge, like the Canadian side by a bridge. I kept seeing like the Ambassador Bridge over there, over in that pocket. And I said it was homicide. Some killed her. And then I gave more information about, people who, with this situation. And I was like, you know, need to look at the timeline. You need to look at the evidence that they're giving. It's wrong. You know, we all know that now, right? From
Yeah, from the
discovery.
years of investigating, yeah.
And then you know, so I just finish with my reading. We connect, obviously, and then I get a call. Actually, it was on my birthday, March 21st, and it's from Michelle, and there was 100 psychics that read on their mom's case, right? And they just filed my paperwork away, right, kind of thing. And at that moment, you know, they were like, they got a call on March 20th, which is the first day of spring. So here we come with all this confirmation, right, from the reading that I gave.
Yeah.
And everything that I had said is where they had found her and whom had found her. And yes, did I say prior to that she was dumped into the water? 100%. Did I say that she was in, you know what I mean, that this was foul play? 100%. So in that process, it was, you know, to me, when I work on a case and we find evidence, we find the bodies, you know, that's, for me, it's like winning the Academy Award from Spirit.
Of course.
Because I've done my job. I should say we've done our job. I've helped a soul. I've helped a family, and this is a great result.
Just as Kelly told the family, Joann would be found. And it would be exactly how Kelly informed them, right at the start of spring and in Canadian waters. It would be 50, 60, and then day 70 would hit without any leads on Joann. It would be March 20th, 2010, the first day of spring. Joann's body was found just off Boblo Island on the Canadian side of the Detroit River, just as Kelly had predicted. It was 2 fishermen who had found her body, and they had alerted the Canadian Coast Guard. The Canadian Coast Guard report indicates that they found Joann Matouk Romain's frozen body where the fishermen stated. Are you ready for red flag number 1 million? When Canadian officials call Grosse Pointe Woods and let them know, hey, a body has been found, Grosse Pointe Farms, you heard me right, Grosse Pointe Farms, who initially investigated because that's where the church was located at and where Joann had gone missing from. But remember, the Farms had given the case to the Woods because that's where Joann lived. Grosse Pointe Farms rushed over to Canada to speak with officials in telling them that she was suicidal. Fucking odd, right? Why would Grosse Pointe Farms, who no longer have jurisdiction over the case, rush over to speak with the officials in Canada where she was found? The Canadian report summarizes, quote, observed a clothed body face down on the rocks and submerged in water waist down. Observed was a scalp of long brown hair entangled in tree branches, black boots with high heels, black pants, and coat. It appears as though the body may have been there for some time, as there were gray-brown algae and zebra mussels stuck to its legs and lower buttocks. Also observed the fingers on the right hand missing to the middle knuckles, end quote. For just a moment here, I would like to focus on the condition of Joann's body when it was found. I have obtained autopsy photos of Joann on the scene of where she was found and when she was transferred to Canadian officials and the autopsy was performed by Dr. Oxley. This may be triggering to some. Feel free to fast forward about a minute and a half. In the pictures that I'm looking at, there is no hair on a woman's head. Her head is bald, her eyebrows are sparse, and her eyelashes are non-existent. There seems to be some inconsistencies in the reporting and the images. It is worth noting that the boaters who found Joann described a woman entangled with trees as having a full head of hair. Although the hair could have simply fallen off when the body was removed, this is still an inconsistency that warrants my attention. Having looked at the photos and the autopsy report from Dr. Oxley, it seems odd. I would like to state that despite being underwater for 70 days and traveling the lengths that she would need to, her body is in great condition aside from some animal bites to one hand. I found it particularly odd that Joann still had both eyeballs. This is highly unlikely, and animals typically feed on the eyes first. On the right hand of Joann, she would still have the red nail polish on. The Canadian coroner, Dr. Marvin Oxley, performed his autopsy on March 20th, 2010, the day that Joann was found. Dr. Oxley notated in his autopsy report that neither United States nor Canadian police suspected foul play, and that while Miss Romain's entry into Lake St. Clair was not witnessed, there was some circumstantial evidence that she may have intended to take her own life. The report notated paranoid psychosis. Did Grosse Pointe Farms police inform Dr. Oxley that Joann was suffering from some sort of paranoid psychosis? Seems more than likely to me. Out of all the evidence that I have received from the family, I have not received any type of document that specifies that Joann was diagnosed pre-death with paranoid psychosis. I'm unsure of the paranoid psychosis that Dr. Oxley would be referring to. Joann had no previous signs. She never voiced to a therapist or a doctor or had been diagnosed. Joann did voice her concerns about one individual, but I'm not sure how that would result in a post-death diagnosis from a medical examiner. The cause of death is a medical condition that caused the person to die. Examples could be gunshot wound, heart attack, blood loss. The manner of death describes the way in which a death occurs. Could be homicide, suicide, accidental, natural, or undetermined. Furthermore, Dr. Oxley wrote that he found insufficient evidence that Miss Romain intended to take her own life. Dr. Oxley concluded that the cause of death was drowning and the manner of death was undetermined. It would ultimately be dental records on how Dr. Oxley could confirm that the remains that were found in the Detroit River, 26 miles away from where Joann went in the water supposedly at St. Paul's Catholic Church, did belong to Joann Matouk Romain. As soon as Canadian official Dr. Oxley performed Joann's autopsy, her body was released to the Macomb County Medical Examiner's office, where Dr. Daniel Spitz conducted a separate autopsy. It's important to note here, Daniel Spitz, the medical examiner, is the son of Werner Spitz. Werner Spitz was a renowned medical examiner, but our focus in this podcast will be on Daniel Spitz, not Werner Spitz. Both Dr. Spitz and Dr. Oxley reached the same conclusions. Spitz noted that the lack of significant injuries makes homicide less likely, and the lack of an explanation of why Miss Romain would be at the water's edge made an accidental manner of death quite unlikely. But just as I've told you before, Joann's children have been concerned about the investigation taking place since the start of Joann going missing. So a third and final autopsy would be performed at the University of Michigan by Dr. Jeffrey Jensen on March 25th, 2010. This would be at the request and cost of Joann's children. Now, I have reached out to Jeffrey Jensen's office and I have not heard back. But what I can say in here, and from the evidence that I have been given, these autopsies do not line up with what Dr. Spitz and Dr. Oxley reported on. I've told Michelle and Kelly multiple times that thankfully they had an instinct and they went with their gut to have another autopsy done outside of the police investigation. Dr. Jensen reported that the cause of death was most likely freshwater drowning, and the manner of death was undetermined. But he did note in his autopsy report that no water was found in Joann's lungs. He noted no significant trauma, but he did note contusions on the upper left arm. Dr. Jensen was the first medical examiner to report the no water in Joann's lungs and to report the contusions on her arm. But he was the third medical examiner to conduct the autopsy. 2 medical examiners before Dr. Jensen did not note either of these. When first reading this, I honestly was a little bit shocked. But honestly, as I kept going through the investigation, shocked wasn't even a word anymore. It made total sense to me that Dr. Jensen was hired by the family. So he had no ties to law enforcement. He had no ties to the investigation. His only duty was to conduct an autopsy that was asked by the family. He was the first ME to report any sort of bruising or any contusions. It's not shocking to me. But let's remember, the purse that was in the car, the purse where the strap was ripped, are you putting two and two together like I am? I truly think that the purse was probably on her shoulder that the night that Joann disappeared, and this could further point to a possible struggle. Joann's purse would be found with money in it that night in the passenger seat of the Lexus SUV. So, robbery obviously isn't a motive. I think Joann was probably grabbed, and the purse being on her shoulder may have gotten tossed around in the mix. Dr. Oxley, for Canadian officials, and Dr. Spitz, for the Macomb County Examiner's Office, ignored them completely during the autopsy and did not note them on their reports. I think it's important that when you are a medical examiner, that you need to report on the condition of a body during the autopsy, and that you must include anything and everything. I think it's extremely questionable why the two autopsies reported by officials missed a large piece of evidence on Joann's body that could further point to foul play and question the suicide motive. So, do you think Grosse Pointe Farms rushed over to Dr. Oxley to tell him that, this woman was suicidal? Your guess is as good as mine. But I do think that they went over there to sway his professional opinion and further plant an idea in his head that Joann was suicidal. So remember when I told you that this is an investigative podcast? Our podcast isn't going to end with just Joann. We're going to continue to follow the line, the trail of everything. Are you ready for the next big piece that makes me question Dr. Spitz as an examiner? Dr. Spitz of Macomb County Coroner's Office had his credibility questioned just 6 months after Joann's autopsy. There was another man, a Michigan banker, that was found in the Detroit River, and at first ruled it a suicide. Coincidence? Probably not. But he missed a gunshot wound, execution style. You heard me right. Another dead body in the Detroit River with a gunshot wound missed and ruled a suicide. I truly believe that there is a connection between these two cases. And I think that Dr. Spitz has further ties to these cases as well. It's not every day that two people go missing within 6 months of each other, found in the Detroit River under suspicious suicides. If you're frustrated, me fucking too. This timeline is just as hard for me to explain as it is for me to understand. Everything in these episodes will find its place, but it's super important that I keep the timeline moving so that we can come back and dissect each instance where something is not right, where something was off. Note how someone acted, the record keeping. If I give you all the information right up front, it's going to be impossible to follow. In the aftermath of Joann's body being found, her children and family are devastated, but it's also a sign of relief that Joann has been found. There is now an answer to the long nights wondering where Joann actually is. But those answers would soon turn to more questions. Questions that would further create a wedge between officials and the family. Despite wanting to know all the details about how Joann was found, the family also wanted to know what was on her body when she was discovered. The list would be small. A necklace, both shoes are on, a coat zipped up, and in her pocket would be a set of car keys. Remember, I told you earlier, keep that in your forefront of your mind. You heard that right. Car keys in the pocket of a missing Joann for 70 days. I told you this case just gets more fucked up as it goes on. Joann was in the water, supposedly they say for 70 days, but in her pocket were a set of car keys. So, how did car keys get in the pocket of Joann, who was missing for 70 days, but then keys were given back to the family when they returned the Lexus SUV? I'm confused, you're confused, we're all confused. To this day, they have not been able to locate where any of these keys came from aside from the ones that were inside of Joann's pocket when she was found. To this day, they have also not been able to locate where the rosary and Joann's cell phone are. It does appear that Joann forgot to turn her cell phone back on after being at court that day. The last ping came just before 8 a.m. on January 12th, 2010. That would be the last day that Joann would be alive. Investigators are not investigating, so Michelle and Kelly take the lead. The investigation would become theirs at this point forward. They know that they have no trust and faith in the officers to do their due diligence. So Michelle and Kelly began a list of suspects that they had drawn from the beginning, and they start moving down the list. We're going to go back to Tim Matouk. Remember from episode 1, Joann's first cousin? Let's refresh your memory a bit. I know this is a lot. Tim had worked with the Michigan State Narcotics Task Force in 2010. As we discussed in episode 1, Joann was fearful of Tim. Right before Joann had disappeared, she had told her kids, if anything happens to me, look to Tim. So, do you have the question I have? What was Tim doing the night that Joann, in quotes, committed suicide on January 12th, 2010? Well, if you ask his fellow colleagues over at the Michigan State Narcotics Task Force at that time, they're going to tell you that he was in Warren doing a stakeout for a drug bust. But due to the fact that Tim was alone, there is no way to physically confirm that he was there. There are no eyewitnesses to point that Tim was in Warren that evening. Now, Karen Drew from Local 4 News has covered Joann's story from the start. It'd been 14 years this past month that Karen Drew has been talking, sharing, questioning. She's done an incredible job of truly keeping Joann's story in the news. It would be 11 years after Joann was murdered that Karen Drew would have the chance to speak with Tim Matouk publicly for the first time. During Tim's interview with Karen Drew from Local 4 News, he states, quote, "I have been the victim of a witch hunt," end quote. The children of Joann have always mentioned that he was on a police radio, which can actually be used anywhere in the state of Michigan. Tim did not need to be in Warren to be on the radio talking. Is anyone really going to notice he isn't there while he is talking on the radio? If you ask his colleagues, they're going to tell you that no one physically placed him in Warren. No one saw him with their own eyes. Tim states, quote, "First off, I would never risk my job over that. I would never leave my partners vulnerable," end quote. So, if you're asking about his whereabouts the night of Joann's disappearance like I've been, they're going to tell you he was in Warren. But like I said, no one was there to physically place him. So, what's the thing I turn to? I turn to his phone records. Tim's phone records have told me a lot in this investigation. What I can say for now, that from his phone records show that he did ping in Warren, Michigan during a few calls on the evening that Joann went missing. But during Joann's apparent, quote, suicide, no calls are made from his phone. One of the last calls on Tim Matouk's phone would actually be an 18-minute phone call with no other than Ed Milam. Okay, let's break this down, because this is where Ed Milam comes into play and how I think that he is the missing piece to breaking open this case. And I'm just going to put on the record, if Ed Milam randomly ends up dead, we probably know where to look. Now, there are phone records that show Tim Matouk was talking to a phone number ending in 3119 just weeks before Joann had gone missing. Scott Lewis is the private investigator for Joann's family, and he would indicate through 3 separate databases that this phone number was linked directly to Ed Milam. Scott Lewis does mention that there are times that these databases can be incorrect. But, as Scott Lewis points out, it is unlikely for all 3 to be inaccurate at the same time. More so, one would differ from the other 2. So, let's go back to the phone records. This is going to get crazy deep, and the best way to follow along is if you look at the images that I've posted on our Facebook page and Instagram at No One Knows Pod. The phone records are part of the subpoena that the family did of a civil case from 2016. To be exact, I'm looking at Exhibit 11. The phone records that I have start from January 1st and continue until March 31st. I have scanned all areas of these, phone number after phone number, breaking down the unknown numbers, searching, finding new names, new companies, new people. 29 times that Ed Milam spoke with Tim Matouk. Almost all of the conversations are under 12 minutes. One conversation sticks out amongst all of the numbers, locations, and times on the paper. On January 12, 2010, at 6:56 p.m., Tim Matouk and Ed Milam spoke for 18 minutes. 18 minutes. on the night and time right before Joann would go missing. I find that odd, just a few minutes before church starts at St. Paul's Catholic Church. Now remember our timeline. At 7 o'clock p.m., Joann arrived to St. Paul's Catholic Church. If you look at Tim Matouk's phone records, from 8:58 p.m. until 7:43 a.m., Tim Matouk would make no other phone calls. So, from 8:58 until 7:43, Tim Matouk cannot be accounted for in eyewitness or phone records. No one physically placed Tim Matouk anywhere the night that Joann went missing. An eyewitness would come forward just days after Joann went missing, before Tim Matouk would be in the spotlight as a person of interest from the family. But that eyewitness is now dead. He was harassed by police, SWAT team on his front lawn. Cars messed with. Joann's family wouldn't find out about this eyewitness until years later through a records request. And on episode 3, we're going to be talking about our biggest person, our biggest eyewitness, Paul Hawk.